Welcome to episode 9 of An Understanding. This episode will be about William Henry Harrison. If you like it, listen. If you don't, eat biscuits. Hope you guys enjoy. The events of this battle are very conflicting. We do know the fundamental ending and outcome of the Battle of Tippecanoe itself, but I'll just give you a very, very, very brief, I guess you could say, outline of what actually happened during the actual conflict. It's the morning of November 7th, 1811. William Henry Harrison has just led about a small contingent of forces of predominantly, Union soldiers, militiamen, a whole bunch of different people for the most part, to Prophettown. He's there to basically see and confront, I can't pronounce his name properly, I'm going to butcher it, but Ten Squatta, I don't know how you pronounce it, but they call him the Prophet, so we'll just call him the Prophet, and the name after Prophettown. He's the brother of the famous Tecumseh himself. William Henry Harrison had brought his forces there previously the day before, and instead of laying, full siege, he decided he's going to camp out, aside of the actual force itself, and basically just wait until dawn to actually continue negotiations and whatnot, and, maybe bring this to a peaceful end. The problem is that natives at this particular point in time, they're not going to be peaceful. They have no intention to be peaceful. You see, the Prophet himself is a very conflicting figure. Many writings saying that, he was always a good person, etc., yada, yada. Didn't want war, didn't want violence. But then, other writings that I would say are probably slightly more accurate entail him basically being and thinking that the Indians are the rightful heirs of God himself, etc., and that the white men are the children of the evil of the world, and that they should be cleansed, and that they have to basically stop everything that the white men are doing. I tend to agree with that, especially with the outcome and the reason why this battle occurs. William Henry Harrison is effectively asleep. And I'm talking about this is dawn, probably about 5, 6 in the morning so far. And a couple of, sentries see some Indians kind of approaching them. They're very wary, and they kind of hesitate for a second. And then the Indians start launching an attack. And then the sentries immediately sound the alarm before some of them are killed and some of them retreat. The alarm wakes basically everyone up. Horns, all that stuff and all that jazz. Next thing you know, all you hear is just gunfire, blood, fighting. It's fascinating. It's powerful. It's something else entirely. The forces are fierce. The soldiers, they're scared. They don't know how to react. And some of them start retreating. And then Mr. William Henry Harrison gets on his horse, and he starts leading his men in the actual charge of battle itself. William Henry Harrison is fierce. He's strong. The natives, they're kind of afraid. They start retreating themselves, and they retreat very deeply into the forest. And William Henry Harrison sees and just exudes power and strength. If some people had fought during that particular point in time, maybe in the Revolutionary War that they were there, they probably think he's George Washington. He's that prominent. He's that powerful. He gives that vision of dominance. And William Henry Harrison begins leading an attack against the retreating natives, driving them away. The losses are fierce. Very, very fierce. Many of them are basically forced to dig their own dead at their own campsite. A lot of them with mass graves. And really, the whole point was because they can't bring them back. They can't bring them back, and they're going to bury them as deep as they possibly could, because they don't want the Indians to dig them up and scalp them. It's unfortunate, though. They do that. But the damage is done regardless. The natives at this particular point in time know that they can't fight back. They know that any chance and any opportunity they had for negotiations, they're out the window. It's war. And there's no turning back. And the Battle of Tippecanoe, in a lot of ways, is the start of the War of 1812. In a lot of ways, the start of the aggressiveness and just, I guess you could say, the wars that would rage on for the next 40, 50, 60 years in this country's history. Whether it's this war, the Seminole Wars, Sitting Bull himself, and Custer's Last Stand, the conflicts that really, truly, fundamentally start, I guess you could say. Because there's always been conflict. There's always been raids between natives, etc. That's very obvious. But full-scale battles and full-scale opposition and full-scale war, that has fully started. William Henry Harrison is our 9th president of the United States of America, and a fascinating one, and a fascinating story to really begin with. If you don't know who he is, William Henry Harrison is one of the most, I guess, I don't want to say controversial because that's not the right word, but one that really changes history. I think in ways that we don't really realize until we actually know who he is and fundamentally understand who he is. He is the shortest-termed president in this country's history and the first to actually die in the office of the executive branch itself. At the time of his inauguration, he was the oldest president ever elected until Reagan and then subsequently Donald Trump. And he lasted a month. He had probably what is considered to be one of the longest inaugural addresses in this country's history. It was like 2.5 hours long, and I guess you would say weather-wise damp and chilly weather, in which he then subsequently dies from, I would probably say the flu or cold, and then subsequently pneumonia, right after that, unfortunately. He's a fascinating person and a fascinating figure that just so happens to really change history, in more ways than one, in ways that, he begins a lot of things. The tradition of, military officers becoming the actual president themselves. And he'd basically be, this person that would start, at least for the very brief tradition for the Whigs, of them appointing just basically military heroes as presidential candidates outside of that 1 year Henry Clay tried to do it. And obviously the 1 year that they had like 6 candidates in the election of 1836, but for the most part, he's the beginning functional person of that. And in fact, for the better part of, I'll probably say, half a decade, it's William Henry Harrison's as a leading figure in the Whig Party itself, and a fascinating one at that too. He's also the recipient of what can be considered a modern campaign. Presidential campaign for the most part, because before, no other presidential campaign, like the time of Thomas Jefferson, they did not actively go out and campaign on their behalf. They had other people do it for them, and most of it was really through newspapers and word of mouth, etc., etc. And a lot of that was also due to the reality of, I guess you could say, the disinterested nature of the presidential office. And then on top of that, it was just, the poor white people couldn't really do anything and vote in terms of the state legislature. And, William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, to an extent, because John Tyler does most of the speeches, begins campaigning, what we consider a modern campaign, songs, slogans, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, going from place to place, to state, to really show, hey, we're going to be the individuals that are going to represent you, etc., etc., etc. Also, him dying in office does something that no one thinks about I mean, if in fairness we think about it now, because that's the only thing that we really think about when it comes to William Henry Harrison and then subsequently John Tyler is the actual presidential line of succession, and no president had ever died in office, and everyone thought that the vice presidency was a very weak position, and no one actually wanted it, to be brutally honest with you. And in fact, it was Martin Van Buren that really was the first person to, actually, I don't even want to say have power as the vice president, but have political power as the vice president, as he would eventually become the 8th president of the United States of America. But, the vice presidency wasn't really a position wanted by a lot of people. And now that William Henry Harrison died, and, it shows that the president isn't all powerful, that is a very, very, very powerful position, because you are one step away from becoming president. And also made things difficult because there really was no clear line of succession. And I'll probably go more into that when I talk later on about when Harrison dies, and especially during Tyler's presidency, which is a very complicated presidency and a very complicated time in this country's history. But who is William Henry Harrison? Because we all know about all this, ridiculousness that happened in this country's history, because this shit happened. So keep this in mind. Like, this is real life, and you need to connect the dots, because I think sometimes when we think of history, we don't connect things to reality sometimes, and it's just like, oh, well, that's a cool little factoid, but like, no, this factoid actually happened, and you can visualize it happening, and probably people are freaking out and like losing their minds, like, why, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm trying to get at is, this event happened, and we had a bit of a constitutional crisis for like the next month, trying to figure out the actual presidential line of succession. I got way off topic there for just a quick second, but who is William Henry Harrison? Truly, because, we all talk about the things that he's most well known for, but who is he really? He's a fascinating fellow. He's a very interesting person. He's someone that I would not want to write a biography about, but I probably would read at least one biography about William Henry Harrison, if that makes any particular sense, Because I mean, ever since I started this series, at least the first 7, I could conceivably write biographies about. And Martin Van Buren, I go back and forth on. The more research I do, the more I find interesting aspects about him. But he's also kind of boring, and not super, super fascinating, and pretty straightforward. And I think William Henry Harrison is a little bit in the same vein as Martin Van Buren. Because first and foremost, you don't have his presidency, so all you really have is just his life, and he has a fantastic and interesting life, to say the least. And if I'm going to be honest, this is probably going to be the shortest episode I'm going to do, which for you guys, is probably going to be really good, but it is what it is. He's not a complicated fellow. In fact, he's probably too simple, and I think that's what probably infuriates me a little bit when I'm researching him, I'm reading about him, because I think because he grew up in Virginia, he has a fascinating life, fascinating, and unique upbringing, and you just want him to get his shit together, if that makes any sense, and you want him to be better, and because I think we tend to think of people, especially who are presidents and who have hold a high office and high esteem, etc., to be these grandiose individuals and figures. And the more I look at William Henry Harrison as just a person and as an individual, I'm thoroughly conflicted, if that makes any sense. And I'll just do the whole childhood thing, go through his entire time, and try and be as specific about him and his life, because I think this is a great example of me needing to be objective, because I always start this and I always go into much more of a subjective interpretation a little bit, and I'm probably influencing people, and I'm not trying to do that at all, but at the very least, I try to be as objective as possible. And this one, I have to be fundamentally objective, because I don't know how I feel about him, to be brutally honest with you. I'll have a very solid opinion by the end of this. So I think we should just get started and hope for the best. So William Henry Harrison, he is born on February 9th, 1773. He will be the last president born before the creation of America and the Declaration of Independence. So I just want to point that out because, this is going to be a very big moment, because the more you do this series and you move on to the actual people's lives, every single child and every single president that is born effectively after William Henry Harrison will be born after the Declaration of Independence and the fundamental foundation of America. So this is a very beautiful moment, and I think I just want to point that out. God bless. Anyways, the Harrisons, they are one of the longest historical families of Virginia, and he's a Virginian, specifically William Henry Harrison. Just like the Madisons, they're one of the first families. I mean, they go as far back as the first Thanksgiving in this country's history, not this country's history, but in Virginia history specifically. And the area that they would inhabit specifically would be really close to Yorktown, I guess you could say. And then, he had a big plantation. His family was very proper and prominent within the actual community in the state of Virginia. They were close with the Washingtons, which I think is just fascinating because little William Henry Harrison's a small baby when 40-year-old George Washington's about to fight for the independence of this country and this nation. William Henry Harrison is the youngest of his siblings in his entire family. There's 7 of them, 3 boys and 4 girls, and unfortunately for William Henry Harrison, he is the youngest boy, which I'll explain just a little bit why that's a pretty shitty thing. His father was Benjamin V, and was a very famous and prominent person within Virginia because, first and foremost, he was a famous and widely driven man. Number 2, he was the governor of Virginia twice, and was basically the head honcho, the patriarch of the Harrison family ever since his father's death. So William Henry Harrison's grandfather's death. Notably, I might want to add from a lightning strike, apparently, and that also unfortunately killed 2 of his sisters. I guess God just said, "You eat on these motherfuckers." That sucks. Anyways, his father's I'm just gonna say his father is a founding father of this country and this nation. His father was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and his nickname was literally the Signer. So that's just how Virginia was, unfortunately. And how he was in particular. His father's fascinating. His mother was Elizabeth Bassett Harrison. She herself came from a long line of lineage and is actually a cousin of Martha Washington and other rich families in that particular area. I mean, she has connections everywhere, and just to basically explain it, I mean, William Henry Harrison is set for life. He's got hookups everywhere. He's basically the most set individual, in the state of Virginia in terms of just the people that he knows for the most part. So growing up, he was very close with his mother. His mother was the main, rearer of the entire family for the most part because his dad's doing founding father shit. Just like many of the other founding fathers, it was just the same, unfortunate same thing. And William Henry Harrison has a fascinating childhood because he's a baby. He's a small child. He'll be 3 when the Declaration of Independence is signed. Technically, he'll be 2 when the war starts. And it must be fascinating to see, just all the Union soldiers. The rising military in Virginia in particular, just a lot more people coming and coming and coming and coming and coming. And, by the time he becomes, he's 8 years old, I believe, when the war, or 10 years old. Well, he's 8 years old technically when Cornwallis in Yorktown surrenders. He actually gets to see it, and he waves to a whole bunch of Union and even French soldiers saying, "Oh," and salutes them, etc. Cool little things like that. But it's a bit of a tense childhood for the most part. A lot of anyone that was a founding father of that particular time and era, and one that specifically was a part of the actual Congress itself, just like partially his father. you were going to be targets of the British and loyalists for the most part. I keep saying for the most part a lot. I just don't know what to say. So his family was always on constant watch of, potential attack from the British, even natives, because they're in Virginia too. So, it was a bit of a tense childhood, and from time to time his family would have to leave. They would leave. At one point they left, and when they came back, their farm was actually burnt down, unfortunately, at Berkeley, and it was very difficult for young William Henry Harrison to actually kind of grow up like that. Not even just just the fact that he's in constant fear, potentially, but he feels safe within the military. He feels safe within, the army, and he feels safe with the soldiers that are there to defend them, So he's had, I don't want to say he had a love for the military, but he always had an admiration his entire life for the military service. So I think that's really interesting, And, his upbringing was very fascinating because, Virginia, unlike a whole bunch of other states and other societies in general around this particular time, like a caste system kind of existed, okay? And a caste system existed in particular with Virginia and several other states, and, it just happens, it's just like, logically, let's say you have like 3 brothers, and you're the youngest. The oldest is the one that's going to get most of the land, most of the actual plantation, and at least like the big pieces of it, and then second kind of get some stuff, third kind of, and the youngest doesn't really get anything. That's just sometimes how it works, and for William Henry Harrison, he basically is unfortunately in this type of family. His older brother's going to get everything, and unfortunately for William Henry Harrison, his options, and particularly around that point in time, are, they're kind of limited. So, he could hypothetically be maybe a lawyer, he could be a doctor, he could do some stuff for hope that he marries into wealth. You know what I'm saying? Maybe he's slaying that good dick around. I don't know, But, for William Henry Harrison growing up, he realizes this, and he understands this. And his dad's a little bit older, too, so you have to remember that. And he is growing up knowing this, trying to figure out what the fuck he's going to do for the rest of his life. And this is something that he's going to constantly be in inner turmoil with for a majority of the early portion of his life. So his eldest brother, Benjamin, is going to be one that oversees the estate when his father dies. His second brother, Carter, I think his name is Carter, he would be a lawyer. And William was the one that was going to hopefully be married into a family, and effectively, I'm just saying this now because, it's going to be pertinent to the future of William Henry Harrison. They start really pushing him towards a career as a doctor, which is interesting, There's really not a lot of doctor presidents. But, his relationships with his parents, it's mixed. He's never really particularly close with his father, for 2 reasons. One, his father's about 50 when William Henry Harrison is born as the youngest one, and his father's doing founding father shit. His father will be the signer of the Declaration of Independence. His father's basically going to be part of the Virginia Constitution and the creation of the Constitution itself. And just doing founding father shit. He's far more closer with his mother. She would be basically the individual that's going to really educate him, along with other tutors for William. And she herself is really going to be educating him until he's about 14, and really ready for college for the most part. And it's interesting, like I said before, William Henry Harrison gets to grow up, during the actual revolution itself, and constant fear, being protected, loving the military, etc., etc., and, he would read military books too, and just do normal kid shit during this particular time, or try to do normal kid shit. So, you have to think it's kind of interesting, once the war actually ends and there's peace for the most part after, 1781, until they actually ratify the Treaty of Paris and stuff. After that, he kind of has to adjust to a normal childhood. Like he's, fuck, I don't have to do, drills that the British are coming. Okay, cool. So I can just go have a normal Virginian childhood and hunt and yeet on this fucking rabbit. Like, okay, cool. Not yeet. That sounds sexual. I meant yeet like I'm gonna fucking dominate that rabbit. I'm making this horrible right now. Anyways, moving on. He had a normal Virginian childhood. You know, he grew up hunting, farming too. In particular, he learned how to farm from a lot of the other people, his family. His father's never really the greatest farmer, and above all else, his father was really terrible, just really fucking terrible with money, and would actually really put a lot on the older two brothers to really succeed in life, as for the most part, both on their careers and just taking over the estate for the most part when when his father effectively gets a lot older. And in a lot of ways, this actually becomes a bit of a problem for William Henry Harrison, because it allows him to actually relax. So because his brothers are picking up the slack, so he can kind of just chill and vibe out for the most part, smoke the equivalent of a colonial doobie, and really figure things out for his life. Like the truth is at the very least in his childhood, for sure, William Henry Harrison was kind of a wimp. I don't mean to be rude. He was delicate, he was emotional. He was very, well, at least what they would describe as emotional. But he was someone that it was difficult for him to process things. In the very early goings of his life, his mother would actually call him delicate. In particular. And a lot of this has to do with just the amount of information that he's basically going to be taking in. I mean, he grew up in war, and trying to adjust to normal life might be a bit much for some people, and I don't blame him, especially with all the fear and the emotional stress that it really takes. Not to mention too, like his life is just really, really, really complicated. He's this rich person, but he's really not gonna be given anything that he can build off of. He's gonna have to really build something for himself for the most part, And don't get me wrong, like his brothers worked hard at the things that they got, but they were given an opportunity in relative comparison to William Henry Harrison, who's basically gonna have to start from scratch. And don't get me wrong, it's not like he's gonna be starting with like the worst people, okay? Because once he learns, once he enjoys his upbringing and he starts getting his shit together, as a young lad, all the while his father's health is kind of deteriorating, and he doesn't know what he wants to do with his life. And ultimately, I think he's one of those kids that I think when his parents are just pushing him to do something, he's just like, fine, I'll fucking do it, I'll just do it. Then again, and when I meant that he was, despite not having the same things that his older brothers got, he was definitely given a real opportunity to learn medicine, because they wanted him to be a doctor. And there's literally no better person in the country than Benjamin Rush. Okay, I mean, he's one of the foremost, scientific, medical, leading experts, in that colonial era, and quite possibly one of the most important figures, I would say, in that particular point in time, that does not get talked about enough, as Benjamin Rush. And his father's, like, it's fascinating, because like his father's basically like, hey, you like William Henry Harrison, here's my son, can you like teach him how to be a doctor, Benjamin Rush? He's like, all right, cool. Like, his father knows everybody, has enough leeway to pull strings to get things done for him, which kind of sucks at times for William Henry Harrison, because this would be a bit of a negative on the aspects of his military career, at least in the very, very early going, until he was able to functionally prove himself. But anyways, he gets older and he gets the opportunity, and his parents are basically saying, you can't pass this up. You pass this up, you're not a Harrison, okay? Like, you gotta do this. You gotta do this, boy. And William is just like, fine, I'll fucking do this. So, he effectively decides around by the time he's 14 that I'm gonna pursue a career in the medical field, But he's never fully solidified on anything ever in his life. I feel like, because the more I read about him, and like, he did not want to be a doctor, but he just did it just so that he could be secure in something without. And don't get me wrong, it's especially around those particular times, you kind of just gotta do what you gotta do. You gotta do what you're given. And William Henry Harrison is the kind of person that he probably at the very least grew up in some relative wealth, and probably wanted to do something and figure out that he wanted to do something meaningful with his life, and just his father's a great influence. His brothers are going to be really prominent people. He sees all the founding fathers, well, not like every day, obviously, but, he knows some of them, and, all these people are fucking go-getters, whatever your opinion is of the founding fathers, They're fucking like, oh, gee, we're going to fucking do this shit. We're gonna fucking yeet all the way to independence, y'all. And, you want to talk about role models and people who are going to influence you, I mean, there's no one grander than the actual founding fathers themselves. Like, no one's going to beat George Washington as a particular fundamental male influence on how to actually live your life and be someone who's going to be disinterested and be this awesome person, And in fairness, I think I think he would like to be a doctor, to probably help, maybe even be a medic, and I think that's probably what he was thinking of, at least in terms of war, combat, etc., etc. So by the time he's about 14 years old, and his parents basically push him to be a doctor, If he can study under Benjamin Rush, that's fantastic, And it's a really good financially lucrative career. And, he's incredibly apprehensive, And he gets the opportunity to go to the college at Hampton, Sydney, instead of, I guess you could say the OG school, William and Mary, that every single founding father, I swear to God, went to. And I mean, part of that was also because of money, but also because if you can study with Benjamin Rush, you can study with Benjamin Rush. That's all I gotta say, So young William Henry Harrison, he's about 14. He enters college. Growing up, he's very apprehensive to a lot of things. Like I said, he's timid, I guess is probably the right way to say it. And when he gets to college, he starts breaking out of the shell. And I think part of that has to do with, when you're free, when you actually are allowed to really do things without the influence of your family, your parents, etc., and you can make choices for yourself. I think that's really crucial for a lot of people. And a lot of the founding fathers, they really had their own free will once they went to college. And even George Washington, when he became a surveyor, he said, for the first time, he actually felt truly free, And William Henry Harrison's kind of, I think, the same thing, And he got to learn everything that he wanted to learn, Greek, Latin, history, He got excited, and he was really proud of himself whenever he got to read Charles Rollins' history books on Greece and Roman history. He said he actually read it 3 times before he was 17, as a bit of an accomplishment, And I guess you could say he just had a typical education during that day, just a regular, normal, liberal education for what constitutes a college student, Which it kind of sucks, because then now I'm just thinking, like, man, we should probably go back to learning Greek and Latin and all that in school. I mean, a lot of the kids probably wouldn't like it, but come on, guys, like liberal arts back then is very different than liberal arts right now, I would probably say. For 3 years, it was really brilliant. And William Henry Harrison really enjoyed himself, and a lot of people started liking him. And plus, it's kind of cool to, be the son of a founding father. So, what I'm saying? Get some street cred, get some bitches, you know what I'm saying? So he studies there for 3 years, and after 3 years, tensions start rising. Because you have to understand, around this particular point in time, I guess you could say the Second Great Awakening, or the Great Awakening of religious freedom and fervor, etc., etc. It's coming, and there's a lot more evangelical revivals, people kind of being pushed into the religion, and religious fervor is really coming up in this country. And the importance of religious freedom, really understand that. And his family, I don't even want to say is apolitical or atypical with religion. They were Episcopalian, but it was a bit of a problem. And his family didn't want him to be influenced by these, religious zealots, etc. These religious crazy people, So he ends up being taken out of school, comes back home, and for about a year, just attends a regular boys' academy to finish, for the most part, his general education, or whatever would be the form of his liberal arts education. He was a little bit bummed, obviously, but it is what it is. And William Henry Harrison, I think his parents saw it too, especially at this time. He's very susceptible to a lot of things, because William Henry Harrison's kind of like this weird sponge, ideologically and personally, where he's just like, he's not sure of who he is, to be honest with you. So I think he's just taking a whole bunch of things in. His parents saw that, it's not like he's dumb. It's just, he hasn't made up his mind about, life in a functional way. But anyways, comes back home, and then after graduating from the boys' academy, his father talks to a couple of friends, because he wants to start him on his medical career, and he's like, yeah, he's not ready for Rush yet. He's not ready for Big Boy Ben. You know what I'm saying? Big boy Benjamin Rush. So first he sends him to Richmond. Richmond being, I don't know if it was the capital yet or not. It might be getting it mixed up. It's a pretty big and prominent city, state, or town, I guess you could say, in Virginia. And I mean, it's now the state it's actually now the state capital. But he goes and studies under this physician, Andrew Leeper, and and it's pretty cool. And he's like, okay, so this is what a scalpel is. Okay, cool. Little things like that. And he enjoys the life of the town and whatnot. But the big problem in Richmond is two things. It's a very politically active town, and understand, like, timeline wise, at the very least, we're around Washington's first term as president. It's around 1790-ish or so, 1791-ish, and there's politics, unfortunately, and his father's still within the thick of the whole political game, the whole politics of what's happening. And it just so happens that this is like the very fundamental foundations of what would become the abolitionist movement, really starts around this particular point in time. It wouldn't actually really gain substantial traction until like around 1820, when the South basically is just like steadfast in keeping slavery, as a means of the rights of man, et cetera, and it's like, oh hey, but around this particular point in time, people are like, we should probably just start freeing these motherfuckers, you know what I'm saying? And Richmond is a bit of a politically active town, and there's a bit of a abolitionist movement there. So there's this guy, Robert Pleasance. He's a big abolitionist individual there, and he meets with William Henry Harrison. He's like, hey man, we're a politically active town. You're a young lad. You want to join the abolitionist movement? And Henry Harrison's like, oh, well, this is interesting. And his father basically just says, no, you're not going to influence my son. Whatever, yada yada yada. So after having some words with Robert Pleasance, his father takes him out of Richmond, takes him back home. And I just want to say that William Henry Harrison would own slaves throughout his entire life. And if you want to talk about crossroads moments, I'm not saying he's going to effectively become an abolitionist or never own slaves. If he stays in Richmond, does all this stuff, things happen. Who knows? But I would probably say one of the more influential people who could have really steered him in that particular direction in a particular point of time in his life is probably his time in Richmond, Virginia, by Robert Pleasance, which is unfortunate. So William Henry Harrison comes home, and his father's in talks with Benjamin Rush to finally, have him join his medical, staff, I guess you could say, and really learn how to be a physician, how to be a doctor, and have a career in the medical field. And William Henry Harrison's really apprehensive about all of it. He doesn't want to do this, but at the very same end of the spectrum, he's not particularly good, I think, he believes, at anything else. And at the same time, he wants to be like a military officer, I think, in a lot of ways. And and I want to say it's not looked up upon by any stretch of the imagination, but I think, like military officers didn't really make a lot of money. It was very difficult to be financially settled in that particular, because during Washington's presidency, there really wouldn't be that much of a functional need for a military, and, it just wasn't a prosperous position or a particular point in time for anyone to be a military officer. So, you had to find a bit of a career for yourself. So he's stuck. And he just keeps going with whatever his family's going because they're the ones that are paying the bills. And his father's the one that's really trying to front a lot of the money to actually support his education. So he's like, hey, boy, you're going to go and finally learn under Benjamin Rush. And he's like, fuck, do I really have to? And he's like, well, yeah, you got to. Anyways, so Benjamin Harrison goes to the University of Pennsylvania and effectively starts learning under Benjamin Rush in the medical field for the most part. And, while he's traveling there, he gets word of his father's sickness, etc., etc. His father would have medical problems. First off, like I said before, his father's a lot older. And he would suffer, especially in the latter years of his life, especially. I would probably say, for the majority, I would say William Henry Harrison's life just suffered through medical ailments, notably gout. He was always dealing with stuff in like 1791. And as soon as he got there, as soon as he began his studies, actually, he gets word that his father died. And his father's just like, dead, obviously. And so, he goes back immediately real quick. He's like, damn, fuck, I just started this motherfucker, and he's at this point, he's probably, been in school for about 2 months before he goes back to settle his father's estate, all that stuff. And it's unfortunate because he comes home and they come to find that his father's pretty broke, very, very broke, and whatever's left goes to the eldest brother. And thankfully the second brother has a career in law, and there's really nothing for him or the rest of the family, all the daughters and whatnot, and the wife. And it's very clear that for Benjamin, for William, there's really nothing for him. There's not even enough money for him to really continue school, which for him is kind of relieving in a lot of ways, because he's like, oh, I don't have to go back to school and do all that medical bullshit. So, William Henry Harrison is in a bit of a pickle, though, because there's really no money, and, he doesn't want to be financially dependent on his entire family for the rest of his life and be a know-nothing, do-nothing kind of person. And yet he has no career prospects, genuinely and relatively speaking. There's no money, there's really nothing he can do. So, he spends probably a week or two, a couple weeks, to really try and figure out what he wants to do. And he's contemplating a couple things on, well, do I want to maybe be a merchant trader? Do I want to do this? Do I want to do that? I think people should probably do this more often, where you actually have an opportunity. Take a week, figure things out for yourself. What do you really want to do? And especially nowadays, we have the ability to really look things up and figure stuff out. What career, what life do you want to live? And I think for William Henry Harrison, he was always leaning towards that. But if you wanted, he basically just was reaffirmed after, he read some books and was like, that's it. I read this Washington book, let's fucking go, son. And he ends up deciding he wants a career in the military. Take the back. Well, he initially tries to do a whole bunch of different things on the side. First, he works for the government, or attempts to work for the government in some jobs, some clerkships for private businesses, and then eventually he's like, all right, fine, I'll fucking finally join the military. The governor at the time was Governor Henry Lee III. He was a really close homie with his father. And he's like, hey, can I just be like Washington a little bit and, give me the hookup so I can get my own army commission? And he's just like, all right, fine. I'll give you the hookup and give you your army commission. So after talking with Henry Lee, personally signed off, by the way, by George Washington, because, he and Big Daddy Washington were pretty close, and the family was very close with the Washingtons. He was president at this particular point in time, so I think it's kind of funny. So again, I just want to make the point very clear, too. The military was non-existent at this point in Washington's first term. Like I said, there's no need for the military. It was not well paid for because of the numerous debts, and well funded due to the numerous debts that the country had, And, understand at this point, too, that, 1791, he was 18 years old in charge of, I believe it was the 1st Regiment of the Infantry of the United States Army. And, and at this time, being a military, it's fascinating because you have to understand that, recruiting back then versus recruiting now for the military, vastly different. Okay, like you obviously have your, offices nowadays, but like William Henry Harrison's basically just going into bars and pubs and be like, hey, you want to serve in the United States military, And I mean, for him, he effectively had to kind of create his own commission in a lot of ways, and was really just going from place to place that he could to recruit for officers and soldiers for the United States government and the military. He would actually start staging parades to help bring people in to join the army, whatever he could do. He would actually, I guess you could say, the first signs of his campaigning and his ability to really campaign, and really just push forward this idea of, yay, come fight for your country, etc., and really just went off of that. So you're probably asking yourself, why is he recruiting all these people to begin with? Like, a lot of reasons. First and foremost, obviously they need men for the military in general for protectionist reasons, and they don't want to have to just rely on militia, and it's difficult because you have to understand, like, the Revolutionary War technically just ended like a decade ago, and the biggest problem was they couldn't pay their officers, so a lot of people who were still of fighting age or, older really were apprehensive of joining any form of military because they weren't going to be sufficiently supplied or paid. Still true even at this particular point in time, and it would still be very true until probably, I would say, the Mexican-American War, when they would actually figure a whole bunch of shit out. So, but the second reason, too, was because, there's rising tensions, there's growing problems within the country itself, and, this would be an issue that would really begin with Washington's presidency, but would really explode in parts and escalate to a point that, by the War of 1812, it's no longer a small issue, and it has to be dealt with, and that's the Indian attacks in the Northwest Territory. The Indian attacks in the Northwest Territory, it's around the area of, like, Indiana, etc., etc. The place that he's going to is going to be actually, I believe, close to where Cincinnati is, specifically. He was supposed to basically be rounding up men and whatnot for effectively what would eventually become a small-scale war in the Northwest Territory to clean up, I guess you could say, residual problems with the natives and the British still pushing the natives to antagonize the people there. This is actually remnants of the Revolutionary War, if I'm going to be honest with you, and still kind of an issue because people are trying to expand westward, and they have this Northwest Territory, and they're trying to just keep pushing and pushing, but the Indians just keep fighting back with them, and Washington's like, well, can you get a shit ton of people, etc., and yeah, get them over there and fuck these Indians up, and William Henry Harrison, he's like, I got you, man, we're Gucci, and and it's fascinating because this recruiting is very interesting. Like, William Henry Harrison's the kind of person that's like, he would recruit you, and you talk to him, and it's like, man, you really love this military life and stuff, because he really does, because he grew up with the military. It's been a part of his life. The Revolutionary War, skirmishes with natives. He felt a kinship to a lot of people in military uniform, but which is kind of funny because when he actually becomes, the leader of these men and goes up to the Northwest Territory, they're kind of just like, dude, you're kind of a shitty person, you're pretty terrible leader, etc., and like it's just the side, like the two sides of William Henry Harrison, I think is really, really interesting. I'll get to that though. I think I'm getting ahead of myself for that. But anyways, he has to recruit at least as many men as he possibly could, and go up to what is known as Fort Washington in that Northwest Territory where Cincinnati is, because them pushing westward and northwest in all that particular area and territory, it's a bit of a problem, and it's really becoming a big issue. So he recruits upwards of about 100 men. I think the exact number is close to about 80. as many men as he could actually recruit. And from, I believe, in the area of Virginia, he ends up marching and traveling through the relatively peaceful parts of the territories, through the Northwest Territory. It's a pretty peaceful journey, I would probably say. In some writings, it's just they kind of just skip around to it because some of his writings just go back and forth between. I guess what I'm trying to say is I couldn't really find much details about the actual journey itself. But he ends up going from wherever he's at to the Northwest Territory, and it takes some time. And by the time he gets there, he already sees there's a shit ton of problems in this weird settlement near the Washington fort. The tensions are rising, like I said, troubles across, and there's about, I'll put it this way, once they get to the fort, they realize the settlers are kind of struggling a little bit in their particular area. There's like 40 families there, and there was only a small battalion that was there to really deal with the settlement attacks and the issues that were occurring with the settlements when they arrive at the actual Fort Washington itself, And for them to actually see the problem itself, I think is a little bit eye-opening to the reality. So once they arrive at the fort, 100%, the fort's in complete disarray. The settlers are having issues and whatnot, and and William Henry Harrison's getting word of everything of what's happening. The territorial governor at that time, I forgot who his name was, but anyways, he actually suffers probably what I would consider one of the single worst defeats in this country's history. It's known as the loss of St. Clair's. Basically, like, the native forces doubled the actual American forces, and I think it was probably 500 natives to 1,000, regiment strong Americans, and about 2/3 of our forces end up just getting fucking destroyed by the fucking native forces with minimal losses on their side. The opponent, by the way, his name is Little Turtle. So I just want to point that out, that we lost to an Indian chief named fucking Little Turtle. Anyways, once he arrives there, William Henry Harrison initially tries to establish, I don't want to say superiority, but hey, I'm your guys' officer. Yeah, you gotta work with me, and his men did not like him, and they didn't like each other, in fairness. So everyone that he brought really didn't build a very strong bond, which Harrison saw as a bit of a problem. And especially for his men to see him, yeah, you brought us on and stuff, but the truth is that you're just a fucking recent college graduate, and you got this gig for nepotism for the most part, And William Henry Harrison had some problems with that, obviously, because he is an officer. And, tensions just continue to rise because, the conditions at the fort are terrible. Tents just laying around everywhere, lack of supplies, guns. People were drunk more often than they were actually sober, and that would cause a lot of problems. More tensions, obviously, people fighting each other, and just excessive drinking. And the conditions there in general, people actually start dying, and it's unfortunate. So a lot of his men would end up dying. A couple of his men would actually die just because they got too drunk and exhaustion, I guess you could say. Notably, William Henry Harrison's never a drinker throughout his entire life, and I would probably say it's moments like this that really kind of emphasize his lack of the drink, I guess you could say. But anyways, understand just the conditions of the Northwest Territory and the Fort Washington being one of the most, I guess you could say, westward, for the most part, and trying to settle a particular area. The Indian problem is a real issue, and it's unfortunate because he's actually going to be in this place for quite a long time. So understand, the year is about 1791. He, along with his contingent of men, really arrive around the winter of 1791 in the Northwest Territory. And at this particular point in time, I guess you could say this is a small-scale war. I mean, this would be known as the Northwest Indian War, as the tensions continue to rise and whatnot. I mean, this is such a small and short war. I didn't really include it in Washington's episode in particular, and thought this would be much more prudent for William Henry Harrison, because I can go in more detail with it for the most part. After some time, it's very clear that there's really no fundamental leadership at the fort itself. William Henry Harrison's too young. He's not ready. And then the other officers and leaders there are clearly just not getting the men disciplined and in shape. So George Washington makes a crucial move and sends the Major General known as Mad Anthony Wayne, who takes control of basically the entire military force, just in the entire Western Territory, in very early 1792. He comes to the actual fort itself, and he's like, "Yo, what the fuck, man?" And he's just like, He's like, "All right, come on in." And he ends up taking William Henry Harrison into his command specifically. For initially appointed to be a cadet, he would actually eventually be quickly a lieutenant. What is it? Just lieutenant. Sorry, I thought it was another rank for the most part. Becomes a lieutenant there, and I mean, Mad Anthony is not only he's specifically at that particular fort too, in order to whip all his troops into shape, discipline them, get them ready, and it's fascinating actually, because he is initially a cadet, but he eventually, then it becomes a lieutenant, but then he eventually becomes a captain. After a scandal ensued because that involved the original captain's wife that he actually took over, and it's funny. And he and Mad Anthony Wayne, Mad Anthony Wayne was a much older general, obviously, at that point in time, and he actually took a liking to William Henry Harrison. He showed a lot of promise, a lot of intelligence. He was on top of his duties, and despite his soldiers having some animosity towards William Henry Harrison, Anthony basically was just like, "Okay, you're my boy," and specifically had him be his captain, and I guess you could say the equivalent of an aide-de-camp, which it sounds kind of dumb being aide-de-camp, but it came with a substantial pay increase, which is, I think, like $64 a month around that point in time. I mean, if I had to put it in like modern day money, it's probably closer like probably $2,000. It's nothing to write home about, but it's for a young single bachelor man. It's pretty solid and it's good. It's better than nothing. So the fort itself, Fort Washington, I probably should have just made this clear too. I don't know if I really did. The whole purpose of the fort was to protect the settlers in the area, where tensions over the next couple years just rose and rose and rose and rose. Because if they would settle in a particular area with their small little towns, I guess you could say, when any problems arise, the fort would be right there, like maybe half a mile away, and be like, we're gonna come and you're in charge, and against the Indian raids and whatnot. At least that was one of the functional purposes of it. And 1792, 1793, he would be at this fort still. And around this particular time, it's unfortunate, but his mother would also die too. And both parents are dead, and whatever inheritance that comes from his mother, comes from his mother. What he gets some land, I guess what I'm trying to say, is specifically from his mother. It's a small parcel. It sounds stupid, but it's because when I was reading, it's like, oh, he's received a small inheritance of land, but then the small inheritance of land that he gets is literally a fucking couple thousand acres that he would sell land. He would have actually just sell that land, because I think, once he's in the Westward Territory, he's like, I ain't coming back to Virginia, so he ends up buying land in Kentucky, hoping that it would become prosperous, both in land speculation and farming. That would fail pretty miserably, unfortunately. And this would be the beginning of a lot of the financial problems that William Henry Harrison would kind of come across, at the very least in his financial dealings, I guess you could say. Like, he's not a failure financially, but, he's the kind of person that, like, if he does 10 things for, like, financial investments, 7 to 8 of them just kind of fail. And that's more of the track record of his financial career for the most part. So, just to get back on track, you're probably wondering yourself how, like, natives and, colonists, I guess you could say, or Americans, really worked with one another and how they were able to live in coexistence. Well, it was with treaties. Natives would sign these treaties with the colonists and be like, hey, this is our land, stay off this territory, etc., etc. You know how it goes. And the biggest, and for the most part, I would actually probably say at least a slight majority of the treaties were honored on both sides. Biggest problem is, both sides, and not just the Americans, so don't get things twisted, wanted territory and wanted land. A lot of the natives, this would be the rising of Tecumseh and people taking back the lands, So let's not get things twisted and say that was just the American colonists, etc., etc. This is just an issue of just people wanting land, wanting territory. And, you might say, oh, this was their territory first. And I'm like, well, they probably took it from other Indian and Native tribes specifically. So let's not get things twisted, because it's not just Americans fighting Indians, it's Indians fighting Indians, which is why when Tecumseh comes around and he's uniting all the tribes, that's really, really, really big and very, very dangerous for the American government and the United States federal people and all the settlers and whatnot. Because now that they're all united against the Americans, it's like, oh shit, that's a pretty large contingent force. Anyways, people would sign these treaties and tensions would really subside, But the problem is that a lot of these treaties have expiration dates, and, people, human nature, sometimes they just break these treaties because they want war and want the land back. So they do what they can to kind of like, okay, I'll inch here and see what happens, and they just keep doing it on both sides. And especially for some of the natives, if an American settlement kind of inched a little bit more, they would react very harshly and aggressively. So, and that would lead to more tensions, more difficulties for the settlers and Indians alike. And especially contested territories that were not, they were up for grabs, that weren't settled by treaty. So, it was like a free-for-all there where things started erupting. And this would be the precipice for what would be the Northwest Indian War, I guess you could say, with Mad Anthony Wayne leading several thousand men around basically each installation or each fort within that Northwest territory, kind of cleaning it up, taking down the Indians and natives, etc., etc., So I would say for the better part of like 3 years or 2 years that, he's there, Anthony Wayne, along with William Henry Harrison, goes from fort to fort in the Northwest Territory just to stop the Indians, fight them, defeat them, etc., and, keep the peace and dominate and win against the natives. And, for Harrison and others, they would receive a couple of tips and whatnot that several forts, including their fort known as Fort Deposit, would soon be under attack by very, very, very large force of natives. And so if they hear that, they go there. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but this is where the Battle of Fallen Timbers would occur on August 20th, 1794. And, this is a very decisive victory where, everyone's fighting. I'm pretty sure William Henry Harrison leads a bayonet charge or orders his men to do a bayonet charge, but he's actually pretty much in the thick of things. He's say what you will about William Henry Harrison, but he's a pretty brave young lad. And, after the extensive victory of the Battle of Fallen Timbers, he receives this accommodation from Anthony, claiming his bravery, decisiveness, as well as his recognition from his own men now, at the age of 21, for William Henry Harrison, that his own men are kind of just like, you know what, you're not that bad, okay? Like, you're not that college softy that we all perceived you to be initially. You're pretty strong. You're pretty good. We kind of like you. Anyways, right after the Treaty of Greenville would be signed, opening up more than a shit ton of territory in what would effectively be like, I guess, Ohio, at least in that particular area, like the Ohio-Indiana territory, whatever you want to call it specifically. Basically, a lot of land effectively gets opened up, and basically the war for the Northwest Indian Territory and the Northwest Indian War kind of ends around this point in time in 1794 to early 1795. So after the war ends, and they're still in the Ohio Territory, he and Wayne basically just they chill there. They vibe out for a little bit. They enjoy themselves. Plus, at the same time, a lot of it was Anthony Wayne himself, Mad Anthony, because he's getting old and he's very slow, and it's very clear he's actually getting sick in 1795, and they're there to just protect the new territory that they've effectively got for the most part, because they're Gucci American soldiers, and they're there, and a lot of settlers are trying to come around this particular point in time, and Anthony Wayne's like, cough cough, I'm gonna die. William Henry Harrison, continue with my duty, good sir. And William Henry Harrison's like, dude, it's like, this is a lot for me, and he's like, you got this. Bleh. Anyways, this is effectively a bit of a trying time for William Henry Harrison, who ends up really kind of just being forced to stick around, which for him is actually pretty good, and I'll explain that in a second. But he ends up being the captain, effectively, and the main leader at age 22, 23 years old, 21. Like he's a youngin' still, and he ends up basically being the leader of this fort that in the northwestward territory. It's also around this particular time, too, that young 22-year-old William Henry Harrison being in charge of protecting the fort, helping the sick, he sees a large contingent of immigration, I guess you could say, of people coming to this territory, and to the fort itself, to settle the newer areas, where he meets a young woman named Anna Seams. I can't fucking pronounce her last name. It's Symm. ES, and the Seams family. I'm just gonna fucking say it. Who cares? They're all dead anyway. Pardon my language. Don't speak ill of the dead. Sorry. We're arriving with her family. Her father was actually one of the judges of the area, and one of the judges that was actually recently appointed in that particular area. So he's like, "Hey, girl, Anna, what's up with you? What that booty do? And she's just like, Come get it, daddy, that kind of thing. And immediately after meeting each other, because William Henry Harrison's basically like, sir, how you doing? You're the judge of this particular area to oversee all the court stuff. I want to fuck your daughter, and I'll put it to you this way: they were very smitten with each other, but the father would quickly disproved. It's not that he didn't like William Henry Harrison; it's more so for two reasons. One, being, the wife of an officer and a captain and a military individual was not a very financially lucrative endeavor, and because he would literally like just quotes apparently what he said is like, how do you intend to support my daughter, good sir? And William Henry Harrison's like, sir, my sword is my means of support, and man, back then it was probably really, really, really fucking wild. But anyways, he was like, you will not marry this man, Plus, at the same time, the second reason, too, fundamentally was, despite his bravery, despite his competence, I guess you could say, as an officer and military leader, he just didn't like him, or at the very least, thought he was kind of lazy, thought he was a little bit aloof at times, and I think in his mindset for his father, it was just like, okay, you may be a great military leader, but I don't think you're a good farmer, for instance. Or I don't think you're good at this, good at that. How are you going to support my daughter if you don't have any other particular trade other than war itself? You can't survive and live off of this and live off of that. Well, anyways, there's problems there. They're basically taking and dating each other kind of in secret at particular points in time, And one day, his father, or her father, ends up leaving the territory for travel. He's going to whatever he's going to do. And, Henry's kind of just like, man, fuck your dad. And was like, let's just fucking get married. So Anna's like, hell yeah, we're fucking youngins. Let's just do this shit. So they get engaged and quickly they just elope with one another, and by the time her father comes back, his father's like, what the fuck, like, how you plan to do all this stuff, yada yada yada, and disapproved in every notable way, and never really liked him for most of basically the rest of his life. You know, his father or her father basically just hated William Henry Harrison for basically taking his daughter away. How would I describe their marriage, though? Anna and William Henry Harrison. I think the only way I could functionally describe it was just solid. Just a solid partnership and a solid marriage. Be married for basically the entire life. She would actually outlive him by almost 20 years. I wouldn't call this a deep partnership by most accounts and by most writings for the most part. You know, it's not like they didn't love each other, but you know, they would have 10 kids together, only 4 of them surviving into adulthood, and you know, and in a lot of ways, he failed a lot at life, both in business ventures, et cetera, and it puts a bit of a damper. And I'm just saying, you know, obviously, like I don't know about you ladies, but you know, I would understand if your man is just a failure at a lot of things and has these dumb ideas, and you know you're taking care of all the babies and stuff, and it's just really difficult and an extra strain on your relationship trying to be supportive of him, but at the same time, he's like just a failure and has dumb ideas, like, you know, and that's probably what it was kind of like for her, unfortunately. But at the same time, you know, she'd be supportive whenever she could, and at this time, she's probably, if I'm going to be 100% honest, one of the smartest first ladies in this country's history. I mean, her father was a judge. She was highly educated, which is funny because she actually preferred traditional duties. And she was deeply, deeply, deeply religious too, which kind of makes like what she was doing with eloping extremely scandalous, you know. And they would have a difficult relationship. It would not be perfect. And I would not call this one of the great love stories. It's actually probably more so on the bottom of presidential partnerships in history. But solid, you know, very, very solid for the most part. I also want to point out, too, she's the only first lady that's actually never stepped foot in the White House. I just want to point that out very, very clearly and succinctly, because she was sick when he did his whole inaugural address thing, so she couldn't go to Washington to see it, and then William Henry Harrison dies, and she's like, what the fuck? And then, because she's literally, as she's about to leave, and once she's finally better, her husband dies, and it's like, well, poop. That kind of sucks. Well, anyways, yeah, back to real life and his entire story. You know, military life was not very prosperous for William Henry Harrison. You know, despite a promotion to being a captain, for 2 years, and especially in this particular territory, he's really just toiling in agony because he has a wife, a couple kids coming on, a kid coming on the way, and he's really trying to figure out how to actually support his bride, because the military life wasn't going to be functioning. You know, like $70, it's not going to support you in a growing family in this particular era and time. Okay, so he makes a very tough decision because he's been doing the military thing for 5-6 years at this point in time, and he's like, fine, fuck it. So he resigns his commission in pursuit of his financial successes, you know, and his father-in-law's like, finally, fuck, you know, like, you know, and not wanting to see his daughter fail, gives William Henry Harrison some land and some money to build upon something, you know, several hundred acres of pretty prosperous land, and also kind of just fed up that it took him 2 years to, you know, finally fucking leave. Man, that's just a fascinating relationship. People were fucking wild back then, okay, let's just be honest. Anyways, on top of that, getting his land to farm as well, you know, et cetera, both in the Ohio, Indiana territory. His father-in-law also gave him some connections, a portion of a leader to be the Northwest Territory specifically, with William Henry Harrison becoming and pushing himself to be the first secretary of the Northwest Territory. He would eventually be governor of the Indiana Territory, I guess you could say, but he's basically a farmer and a significant political leader, and federal leader, I guess you could say, by the time of around 1798. So, the next couple years are going to be very fascinating for very young, I might want to point out, young William Henry Harrison. Obviously being a father, having a shit ton of kids eventually. Once he's this known as the Secretary of the Ohio Territory, he's just basically a political leader, and I don't want to say he's like the de facto leader, because he's not the de facto leader of the Ohio Territory, but he's like, someone that you can talk to, be like, hey, can you help fix this issue, yada yada yada. And a lot of things are happening. Things are moving very, very quickly. The Ohio Territory itself is it. First off, let me just start off by saying the Ohio Territory is actually really, really, really fucking big. Like, it encompasses everything. It's actually so big that they actually have to have talks about splitting the actual territory itself, which eventually would be in a year or so. That would actually be split into the Ohio and Indiana territory. So let me just make that very clear. But just to simplify it aggressively, in 1798, after everything is kind of settled and, people start coming, immigration and westward expansion really fucking hella picks up steam. I'm talking about really, really picks up steam. So many people start coming that the territory actually is now technically allowed to have delegates and representatives. Although they can't vote specifically on the actual specific matters, they can actually have representatives go to Congress and actually help legislate some issues and some problems for what the actual territory is going to be, which I think is interesting. And one of the first individuals is young 26-year-old William Henry Harrison, who will go to Congress for the first time in 1798, 1799. Understand, too, when I mean he's young, I am talking about he is quite possibly the youngest member of Congress at this particular point in time, at about 26 years, okay? And he gained a reputation, I might want to point out. I don't know what it is. A lot of people just like these particular people. I think he just had a bit of a personality. He kind of just seemed, interesting. He seemed passionate. He seemed, at this particular point in time, I think, just impressive, Like I said, he's not a dumb person. He might be, might choose wrong paths and wrong directions, but a lot of people liked him. A lot of people thought, he's a pretty chill person, and he was a bit of a rising star. And not to mention, too, the people that were still left from the founding father age were kind of just like, my boy William, you're there, So he already had a lot of connections in Congress with his father's relationships, and with those in government. So anyways, one of the biggest things that he would be a part of would be, because he could not cast a vote, whether Ohio was a state. And because you have to understand, Ohio, everyone's like saying, we should get Ohio to be a state, and everyone's like, no, Ohio's way too fucking big to be a state, because that territory encompasses everything, okay? And like, I'm talking about Ohio, like Michigan, Wisconsin, like that's how big it expands that far. It's pretty fucking huge. And they ultimately decide, because he's on the committees and he's pushing for certain legislation to be passed. He knows it. He's actually pretty fucking smart. I'll give him props to this. So he's kind of influencing, like, hey, if the actual territory can be split up, they might need a governor, you know what I'm saying? And to oversee the actual territory itself. So who knows? Maybe I can actually kind of incentivize or kind of put some things in. Maybe I can sweeten some things and push for Indiana to get its own territory and split it up, which he does successfully, I might want to add. And he actually helps certain legislation get passed through, so a lot more people can settle there, and like little things, like he helps incentivize travel for people in the West, and even getting like reform policies, like, while this is American territory, we'll cheapen it and make it much more lucrative for you financially to come and settle in these. Basically, it's just like, okay, I'll accept if that this growing division of political parties occurs. I don't want to be removed at all from my post, and I want to have fair elections, I guess you could say, for the actual Indiana territory. And they're like, done, cool. I think they just wanted someone to just figure something out and just finally have someone in that territory leading it for the most part. And I think both parties were amicable to it, because William Henry Harrison, understand, is pretty apolitical at this particular point in time. He's just like, just fucking go for it. I want land and power, money, etc., etc. Anyways, once he's officially and finally established as the first territorial governor, he resigns his seat from the Senate and finally comes home officially. And his wife's like, well, fucking finally, come fuck me so we can have like 10 kids, and they would start really popping out babies. And, it's around this time, too, he starts buying some land, starts really building his house. in his farm, in his plantation. It would be called grassland. I don't know why he called it grassland, but whatever. Go for it. Strange name. Anyways. And the estate itself is actually settled in the territory that is, or the state that is actually, that in the state that is actually Indiana. And effectively, and he would effectively have this position, I just want to point out, for the next decade or so. He would constantly be elected back into the actual territorial governorship. And during this particular time, too, just an overall expansive view for the next 10 years, I'm going to go more detail in just a second. He speculated in land, invested in mills, businesses. He did everything, even tried to get some textile stuff going on there. Every single business venture that he ended up trying to pursue ultimately always failed. And I just found that really fascinating. Just a lot of things he did, including the land that he sold from Virginia to purchase in Kentucky. He ended up basically losing a shit ton of money off of that. He's like the worst gambler, I guess you could say, and it's really unfortunate and sad because a lot of those moves seem like pretty solid bets, but every single time just failed in every endeavor that he did. Anyways, there were specifically, I would say, a couple extra specific reasons, too, that he was selected for the governorship of the Indiana Territory. One was the apoliticalness of who he was. Two was also just, he's already there. Might as well just fucking leave it there. And someone that, is not going to choose one side or another. And number three, was his relationship with the natives and his ability with the natives. And, if anyone knew how to talk to natives, how to communicate with the natives, it was probably going to be William Henry Harrison. So his main purpose was I guess, twofold: to rule fairly and also negotiate, at least legally speaking, and legal claims, to get land from the natives, In which you have to understand, and I think it was even Thomas Jefferson who said that, the natives really, once they learn how to farm, et cetera, and do all that land stuff like the white man, they won't have as much need for land and territory. Once they have their own plots, they'll be just like us, And most of the founding fathers were kind of okay and on board with the assimilation aspect of natives joining, the population in America. And William Henry Harrison, and his job was to try and get as much land as he possibly could. So he would basically just go from place to place. Hey, Indians, you want to give us this land? We'll give you fucking this and this, or teach you how to do this. And usually they're kind of like, okay, sure, why not? So he would end up getting a lot of land from that, and really signing a lot of treaties in that particular area. I will say, though, in fairness to some, native claims, et cetera, William Henry Harrison, at times when they weren't amicable to, selling their land and learning the tricks of the trade, he was pretty fucking sneaky. Let's just be honest here. He would exploit natives, give them a shit ton of alcohol, and while they were fucking drunk as shit, make them sign away their land, And it happened enough times to where I'm just like, dude, that's not okay. That's not morally good to do. But effectively, he got a shit ton of land. I'm talking about a shit ton. He got about 51 million acres of land through, both generally good means and really sneaky, kind of fucked up ways for the most part. And you have to understand, for the natives to sign away their land, it's pretty difficult, because land for them in general wasn't just about, territory, for a lot of them it was, but a lot of them was like, I don't think we should just be selling this land off. I think this land's for everybody, pretty fucking hippie-ish in a lot of ways. They just thought land itself to own it's pretty fucking weird, dude, just really weird and strange. So before we get into the extra conflicts with the Indians, I just want to point out a couple of things that I think are going to be very crucial for William Henry Harrison and a lot of the things that he did. So let me just start off by talking about natives and colonization, just land ownership in general. Because the truth is that when you look at it, people will interpret it very, very differently. You know, differences in how natives saw the land basically being theirs by right of them being there, or just public thing. And you know, and it depends if you're like a colonizer or a native individual. You know, that kind of person. Because there's a lot of people today that are kind of just like, dude, these lands for the natives, man. I'm like, okay, but which specific natives, you know, because like territory goes back and forth between natives for, you know, hundreds of years. You know, it's not like they didn't kill each other for land. And like I said, with Tecumseh, they were fighting each other, and Tecumseh's important because he's the one that's trying to get everyone to stop fighting with each other so that they can focus their attentions on the white man. Okay, like no one's perfect, you know, and I'm not trying to give, you know, the colonizers, I guess you could say, or the white man in America a pass on any of it. But you know, when you're trying to use that argument to go back and forth, like, hey, you know, they're just the evil people. It's like it's war, it's fighting, it's about land ownership, and you know, whoever wins wins. It is what it is, and it just so happens, you know, America had guns and gunpowder. You know, it's unfortunate, and it is what it is. That being said, you know, I don't like the way William Henry Harrison went about doing a lot of it. And, you know, in fairness, a lot of it happened like that. It wasn't just Harrison. It was a bunch of other people during westward expansion and Manifest Destiny, because it was their destiny to do so. You know, and it is what it is. But I'm not going to be that person who's going to be like, well, fucking just give it back to them. Like, no, I like my iPhones and I like all the shit that I have here. So let's just quit talking about that, you know? I'm going way off topic here. I'm going on a bit of a rant. I apologize. Anyways, the other thing that I really just wanted to talk about was just why William Henry Harrison was really pushing for a lot of shit like this, you know? Were the treaties the right way to do it? And yeah, but there was, I would probably say, two things. First and foremost, that he went about doing it, and at least in some defense of William Henry Harrison. First and foremost, he wanted to avoid war. Okay, if he could do this legally, even if it wasn't a really fucked up loophole, you know, if the natives were going to be bound by treaties, it would stop war. It would stop people from trying to kill each other left and right, while, you know, the settlers were going to be settling in the westward territories, you know, and vice versa. You know, if the settlers were bound by a treaty that they couldn't expand to this particular point in time, then you know what? Like, the natives will be fine. They're not going to... It's just to stop fighting. And in fairness, it really worked for a couple years there, you know, for a majority of the time before the tensions would continue to spiral and go out of control. And number two is statehood. Let me just explain statehood, you know, because remember, it's not like... states should start popping up. Like, you have to understand that, you know, people come to a particular area, a particular territory, and settle in that particular area and particular territory, you know. Once a place reaches a certain population, you know, that sect of land, you know, maybe then they can actually create borders. And then once they have enough people to accumulate enough people that would justify maybe having a House representative member or even Senate members, then they could actually, you know, bring people to Congress, and then they can make their case and plea to whether or not they can actually become a state. And once, you know, enough of that specific area was settled and that territory was owned, then they could actually, for the most part, say, hey, we can become a state, and then, you know, appeal to Congress, hey, can we join the union, you know? That's how it was, and that's kind of how it worked. And it depends on different people's perceptions and interpretations, because when people expanded westward, it was for two reasons, I would probably say, more so than anything else. First and foremost, it's land, and if you're especially a really poor person, you could become pretty rich and lucrative and get a lot of land and own a lot of different things, you know, if you expand westward. And number two, unfortunately, was slavery. And they wanted to expand slavery into the westward territories, which would just continue to expedite an already growing problem. Because, you know, it's not really a problem, I would probably say, until, like, you know, the early 1810s and 1820s, where, like, the westward expansion really kicks off, and it's like, whoa, there's a lot of these territories that are going to be, you know, slave states, etc. We don't like that, you know. And, you know, the more territory that gets owned in the westward expansion, which just want to point out really quickly, and I'll talk about this when we get to James K. Polk. That's probably one of the big faults of James K. Polk's presidency, is just the incredible, massive amounts of land that was grabbed during all the territories and wars that he was going for, that really just expedited the Civil War in a lot of ways. And a lot of it really starts here with, territorial expansion and statehood. Well, anyways, way off topic. William Henry Harrison. Should probably actually talk about this motherfucker. He was a slave owner. He actually did own a lot of slaves and owned a lot of slaves for himself, And he actually pushed to allow slavery, or potential for at least the very least, the potential for slavery to be allowed in these territories, in the Indiana Territory and Ohio. He was a big promoter of it and pushed it. And although many of the Americans actually settling in those lands tended to come from the North or Virginia, who had abolitionist ideals, and really just batted that down like bad William Henry Harrison, and although they wouldn't vote him out or really take him out of the actual governorship, that would be the actual blemish of his record in some ways, was the actual attempted expansion of slavery in the westward territories. In the new territory, I'd probably say from like maybe 1803 to like 1808, tensions are just increasing beyond any scale of recognition, because William Henry Harrison's doing his William Henry Harrison thing, and he's gaining more land, obviously. In fairness, he's not a terrible territorial governor. He's actually pretty solid for the most part, because he speculated land. He tried to bring mills, textile mills, and factories. He actually would really be instrumental in improving the roads and infrastructure in the actual particular region, not by the federal government, but by the state area and some of the taxes that he was able to accumulate. Like, he did a lot of really interesting things. He wasn't terrible by any stretch of the imagination. A lot, like around this particular time, a lot of things are happening. Tensions with Indians. William Henry Harrison, his family is really growing. Kids left and right, And on top of that, just the tensions again rising with these unfair treaties. It getting so bad that a leading chief, a man named Tecumseh, was really angered by the encroachment of settlers. And William Henry Harrison is very aware of this. He notices him very early on, and over time, along with basically the eventual rising tensions with the British during this particular time, because the British had settlements in Canada, and they're really kind of pushing a lot of the natives to really do some negative stuff. And he realizes a lot of things are happening, And there's uncontested territory in the western area, like around Michigan and all that Canada could try and lay claim to, and America's like, no, we got this territory. It's in, I would say, I'm just going to point this out very quickly too. It's where specifically like Detroit is, which would become really popular and prominent when the War of 1812 comes around. Anyways, tensions are leading in that particular direction. Tecumseh immediately gets people aligned. He's like, I'm going to unite all these native tribes and become this great warrior, chief, etc., etc. And in fairness, this dude is pretty badass, if I'm going to be 100% honest with you. Once you actually get to know him and figure him out, he's very smart, he's very intelligent, and, in some ways, had he done it earlier, and had he really fundamentally united all the tribes, he could have really done some severe damage, and, would not have been good. And he's being backed by the British, too, I believe. And at the very least, many of the native tribes are still being backed by the British at this particular point in time. Anyways, a lot of things are happening. British tensions, again, are rising. This is around Jefferson's presidency. And war could be very much upon us, And natives are starting, again, to attack settlers. A lot of natives are starting to attack settlers. Notably, Tecumseh is really leading the charge up into this particular point in time, from around 1808 to like basically the precipice of the War of 1812. This is really starting to scare people, and William Henry Harrison's like, well, fuck, like, this is not good. This is very not good, and it's really starting to alarm a lot of people, and specifically a lot of people in Congress, because the tensions are rising. Because you have to understand, the Northwest Territory and the tensions there really is the actual pinnacle precipice of what war would effectively happen. By the time James Madison becomes president, it reaches kind of a breaking point. Tecumseh's uniting a shit ton of people, and shit's about to hit the fan, and people like Henry Clay they're really pushing for war at this particular point. The war hawks really start coming out, and life will be very, very different. And at this particular point in time, William Henry Harrison, he's doing his thing. He's still trying to negotiate things. He's trying to negotiate tensions. He's very, very aware of Tecumseh, but he's really trying to hold people from losing their minds and starting full-scale conflicts with the settlers and the natives for the most part. Well, he's also doing this, too, at one point now. He's actually really pushing for statehood, specifically for Indiana, He actually really started pushing for it in Jefferson's presidency in 1809. And I would actually probably say that was kind of a weird move by William Henry Harrison with these rising tensions. Like, hey, figure out Tecumseh first, and then maybe talk about statehood. But the excessive push, I guess you could say, both in land negotiations and stuff, really, really put Tecumseh over the edge. Because Harrison was taking advantage of a lack of, I guess you could say, congressional oversight. Congress is they're not looking at these treaties. Let's just be honest here, And, William Henry Harrison, like I said, he's really expediting expansive land. I think another 3 million acres of land or so. And probably some of those questionable treaties probably like one of the shortest amount of times, So that one is going to be, unfortunately, on William Henry Harrison to really push Tecumseh fundamentally over the edge, It rose to a point that, the loss of power due to him pushing slavery into the Indiana Territory, and him pushing slavery into the Indiana Territory, the growing legislature in that Indiana Territory that was really close to becoming a state, the lack of military aggression, I guess you could say, from President Matt. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm going off of my head and I'm going off in a bunch of different directions. Tecumseh saw a bit of a weakness and a lack of power by William Henry Harrison in particular, and a little bit of a lack of power and oversight by the federal government itself, that he actively begins his war. He starts war. William Henry Harrison sees that war is upon them, and he's not going to get the most amount of support from President Madison at this particular point in time, because Madison doesn't want to start a war, because if you start war with the natives, then you're probably going to be starting a war with the British, and then things are just going to spiral effectively out of control, and that's the problem with Madison's first term, unfortunately, for the first couple of years, is him basically just trying to stave off war for as long as he possibly could. But war was going to be upon them, especially in the Indiana Territory, and Harrison knew that there was no avoiding it. Tecumseh was not going to stop, so he would actually send some, I guess you could say, envoys to the actual natives to send word for Tecumseh to come talk to him. Let's actually try and figure this out and set up a meeting, And one day, Tecumseh just shows up, kind of just out of nowhere. He arrives with like a dozen of his best native warriors, and they had never met before. And they actually start discussing terms near the governor's palace, or whatever you want to call it, or the governor's house. And it is immediately confrontational. It is immediately frustratingly, like I guess you could say, aggressive on both sides, I might want to add, but especially on Tecumseh, because Tecumseh apparently is like, I give you this one final warning on the encroachment of lands, and Harrison's like, dude, I bought those lands, okay, your motherfuckers got too drunk, and, we partied too hard, okay, so that was my bad, homeboy. And Tecumseh says, I will give you one final warning. If you encroach on our lands, war will be fought, And actually, it reached a breaking point almost to where a fight would actually almost ensue. And, imagine fucking 12 Indian natives with their archers' bows cocked and stuff, and a couple of, I guess you could say guards with pistols, just basically like, try me, fool, what you got, homie? And, cooler heads prevailed. Tecumseh would leave swearing revenge, And at that point on, they were fierce enemies and rivals. But Tecumseh did admit later on, I believe in some writings and some word of mouth, I guess you could say, that Harrison was very bold, very daring, and that, this was not going to be an easy fight that was going to ensue between the two of them. In the coming months after, 1811, Tecumseh would effectively build his small army, because Tecumseh traveled all across the country whenever he possibly could and tried to unite all the native tribes, rounding up as many of them as he possibly could and telling them to launch attacks on all the free settlers and, all the people that Harrison, fucking were supposed to be leading for the most part and trying to protect, And for Harrison, this is difficult because, one, the statehood's in jeopardy, too, because war is about to happen. So, he's statehood for Indiana, I don't think would happen until like 1816, so it wouldn't happen for a while. But war, it was not going to stop itself. So Harrison's basically like, well, fuck. Madison, war's about to happen. Can we just do something? And Madison's like, all right, fam, fine. So Madison himself, he intervened, got a commission of army troops and militiamen. He just brought a shit ton of people. He brought the fucking hammer down and sent them to the Northwest Indiana Territory for Harrison to effectively be the one to lead into this war with Tecumseh. So Harrison was basically like, give me as many men as you possibly give me. Madison gives him about 1,000 troops, volunteers, just really strong troops and militia, anyone that was going to basically wanting to participate and fight. So it gets about 1,000 men. He's like, all right, fam, let's fucking do this, and he goes to Prophet Town, Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwata, whatever you want to fucking call him. I just call him the Prophet, like I said before. And again, this is just basically what I said earlier. This is the Battle of Tippecanoe. He leads this large contingent force to the Prophets, to Prophet Town, to find the Prophet. And again, Prophet's like, oh, I don't know, the white man bad, and Harrison and his troops arrive, but they're like, yeah, let's not start this, okay? So around late November of 1811 at this point, the natives, they knew where they were, so they went to go scout, yada yada yada, and it's dawn and they didn't want to cause a war, so Harrison and his men did not want to start a war yet. They wanted to try and talk and send some envoys, but it wasn't going to happen, so they wait. The natives basically sneak up in the dawn and kill a bunch of fucking of Harrison's troops. Harrison's like, what the fuck, and he's basically like, fuck you guys, and Harrison's just slow. The biggest problem is that a lot of men died, unfortunately. Harrison showed his rust as a military leader in the Battle of Tippecanoe itself, but once he got on horseback and led his men to battle, it was a very, very fierce battle. He got his men into line, and just started firing their muskets left and right. It was far too much for the natives, and they would retreat into the woods with Harrison giving chase. His men would win the day for the most part. And his soldiers, the biggest reason why the Battle of Tippecanoe was really, really prominent for William Henry Harrison too, was the reaction from his soldiers. Because you have to understand, he's not as spry and young as he once was in his youth. He's probably close to his mid to late 30s now at this point, and his men are basically like, dude, you're pretty fucking badass, strong voice, leadership in the heat of battle. You want to talk about confidence in your actual general, your military leader, there was no level of antagonistic negativity or opinion of William Henry Harrison after this battle. I do want to point out some things that are very interesting because, some news articles and newspaper articles had differing opinions on the actual Battle of Tippecanoe. First and foremost, news, again, around this particular point in time was very slow to reach the populace. It probably took at least a week or two before it would actually reach Maine, for instance, of the Battle of Tippecanoe itself. But once it gains traction, a lot of people had different interpretations of the Battle of Tippecanoe and stuff. Some people were like, this is the British interfering with American business and British aiding the natives and we're on one step closer to war, And then other people were like, there's because people, it was mixed, in terms of, because people, you will use it for propaganda, but then, other people had different opinions of it, Some people saw Harrison for his bravery against the native antagonistic, forces and whatnot, but also saw in horror, some native graves were desecrated in the process. Let's just be honest there. It happens on both sides. It wasn't just the natives digging up, whatchamacallit, American graves and scalping them. It was, Americans weren't the greatest people either around this particular point in time. But, it's war. It's just what happens, and people in angers get fresh. People just get frustrated. People get mad. You killed my homie, so I'm gonna desecrate your grave, and vice versa. And that's just how it was, homie. It's violence. It's antagonism. It's anger. It's emotion. Regardless, though, he proved his bravery. Unfortunately, proved poor leadership on most accounts, though. But showed that once in the thick of battle, in the heat of combat, William Henry Harrison's actually pretty fucking good at doing it. That being said, over time, at least William Henry Harrison, for the most part, despite the polarization, the Battle of Tippecanoe would actually go more positively for William Henry Harrison. And, when he comes home, it's like, oh, our savior, yada, yada, and a lot of people really, really were like, you did what you had to do. You did the right thing, And, this would actually make things very complicated and very difficult. A lot of people saw this as like the beginning of the War of 1812, like the spark that would really increase British tensions, etc., and war was approaching. And Tecumseh was even more angered, because his army was shown to be weak and ineffective, and basically just like, okay, I gotta change my battle plans. I gotta change my formations because this cannot happen. Like I gotta regroup and I gotta get my motherfucking revenge, homie. So he would return home as he led all his men in that particular territory, yada yada yada. War was really, really approaching very, very quickly, and William Henry Harrison sees, because at this point, Madison's already gotten his declaration of war, and Madison's like, hey boy, you want to get ready? And he's like, all right, cool. So he resigns his governorship in December and focuses wholeheartedly on the actual war effort. And the following year, once he receives the orders for the preparations war, the declaration of war was about to happen, because it was taking his fucking sweet ass time, because it basically took a full fucking year before war was finally declared on Britain. But once it was actually declared on Britain, British and natives were just creeping in and taking land from the settlers in the Western Territories, and notably, I might want to add, the fortress in Detroit, who would surrender without a fight. One of the most embarrassing moments for the United States and America. Surrendering without a fucking fight. Some pussy shit that a lot of the founders and a lot of the other people and all the other Americans were basically just like, that's fucking embarrassing, fam. Anyways, war is approaching, and the man who's going to basically fight back in that Northwest Territory is William Henry Harrison. So once Detroit falls, in one of the most disgraceful ways ever. I mean, morale's down at this point. Great Britain and native forces really started taking over a lot of what it would effectively become the Northwest Territory, or the Northwest Territory still. Harrison's basically just trying to, first off, he's given orders to go and retake Detroit. He's a little apprehensive for a lot of things, to be brutally honest with you. For a lot of reasons. First and foremost, he is apprehensive to take Detroit because he just doesn't feel ready. That's a lot of things that he's going to have to deal with, and he's going to have to try and get his forces as secure as possible. So he's recruiting, he's training soldiers, etc., etc. Notably, too, he's just trying to secure rank, position. He ends up getting the rank of Major General. I think at that point he's second to General Winchester. Or as Brigadier General, second to General Winchester, and he would basically just be his number 2 for a little bit, and all Winchester wants to do for him is to basically fight back and defend initially some of the Northwest Territory that's going to effectively be attacked. There's one fort in particular, actually named after him, Fort Henry, or Fort Harrison, whatever you want to call it, that was really well defended by a young captain named Zachary Taylor. I might want to add, who, if you don't know who Zachary Taylor is going to be the 12th president of the United States of America. And, just fighting back for the most part. I mean, if I'm going to be honest with you, a lot of this is politics, and issues would arise for some time. because he really wants to really be the leader of the entire army itself. He's really pushing for the leadership of the army, and he wants Winchester's position. So it actually gets to a point where he decides he's going to resign his commission really late in 1812, despite the war happening. And it actually gets to a point where he just says, fuck it, if I'm not going to get it, I might as well just retire. So he ends up retaking the governorship of Indiana. I think it was this guy, Josh Gibson, who was the interim governor of that particular post. But Madison's kind of like, fuck, man, like, why you gotta do me like that, boo? You know, like, why you gotta do me like that? And fucking basically Harrison kind of just put him in a bit of a titty twister kind of situation. He's like, fine. So Madison effectively is like, if you come back, then you can be the functional military leader of the entire Northwestern Territory. And because basically for two things. One, morale is already down and as low as it gets. So a lot of the early defeats within the actual war itself are partially because William Henry Harrison doesn't want to fucking participate in anything because his forces aren't ready. The men's morale is down. You know, it's like, I get it, William Henry Harrison, but fuck you at the same time, you know, but it is what it is. I think the level of military rank and status that Harrison had achieved as like the major general of all forces, etc., etc. I mean, because he outranked Winchester at that point when he came back, and I think the only other person to have that level of military command was George Washington. So that's just to give you an idea of how powerful William Henry Harrison is, militarily speaking. Ironically, though, he actually suffered with a lot of the same problems that Washington would suffer. They were poorly funded, poorly supplied. Supply chains, munitions would be difficult to really establish, and fresh troops because they had really short enlistments. You know, I think the main difference though is a lot more men were considered free men. You know, and they had their own opinions. And William Henry Harrison had to win their trust above all else, and he did. You know, and a lot of people saw him as this great military leader, etc., and capable and bravery, you know. And he kept them all together, you know. And after some time and some apprehension, obviously, with, you know, the Indians and the natives who had basically commanded most of the Northwest Territory of the Indiana Territory, he's just like, all right, let's fucking yeet our way there. In the beginning of the 1813 Northwest Campaign had really begun. And they had prepared in Fort Meigs, waiting for the time to strike, waiting for their opportunity to strike and attack some strategic points. Detroit being the first one that they were really trying to get back at for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, embarrassing loss, so they kind of want to make up for that. Not to mention, too, it was a very, very, very key strategic point that, you know, if they could get that, then they're Gucci. They're set, you know. I understand, you know, Detroit was a pretty big place in terms of strategic points, and that was their main goal, ultimately. They would effectively get it by September. But, you know, let me explain the Northwest Indiana Territory, because it was a bit of a trial for William Henry Harrison. You know, it was a very key strategic point, and they wanted to retake it, so they marched. It was very slowly because you have to remember, from going from Indiana to where they were going to be going to Michigan, you know, it's pretty rough. A lot of snow, deep forest, and they would go through the seasons, unfortunately. In the autumn, it was hot and rainy, you know. And when they arrived in basically late summer, you know, they basically got a really beautiful opportunity by this mad lad named Oliver Perry, or Oliver Hazard Perry, basically just fucking yeeting the British out of Lake Erie, you know. And by that opportunity that they actually were able to get, you know, fucking William Henry Harrison's just like, well, fuck, I might as well go, you know, because Michigan and Lake Erie, once they retook Lake Erie, the British's supply line was just fucking cut. So they were very, very vulnerable. They crossed the lake into Canada, by the way, and would actually do battles, fierce fucking battles, and make gains within the actual Indiana and Ohio territory. So by the end of September of 1813, William Henry Harrison, after many battles between the British and the natives, would finally retake Detroit. Let me point out that it was such a decisive victory in the battle to retake Detroit and all that, that Harrison and his men immediately went on the offensive soon after, giving chase to British and native alike. Which would start a whole bunch of different battles, notably the Battle of the Thames that would occur in Ohio. Let me explain the Battle of the Thames really quick, because as Harrison's giving chase to the men, they engage in the enemy on this province of Ontario. It's this river that's called the Thames. It's a very fascinating battle, and outside of probably the Battle of New Orleans, this is probably the most important battle in the War of 1812. Both important in turning the tide of the war, as the British really started to worry, at this point, whether or not they could actually retake, some territory, or, maybe even stop. America's probably a real country, so we should probably stop fucking with them, And it's important for morale, too. So I'll just briefly explain the Battle of the Thames, because it's fascinating. William Henry Harrison and his men met the British native army and outnumbered them in every sense of the word 2-1, okay? And the British were basically just on the run at this point in time, and they just said, fuck it, we'll just fight. And you want to talk about a slaughter of epic proportions. The British were not well supplied, and many of them either died or surrendered. And many of the natives fought bravely, but they could not stand up to riflemen and, single-line fire. They were relentless within this battle. And I might want to point out, too, the biggest reason why that this is an important battle is because Tecumseh was there. And Tecumseh himself would fall in the Battle of the Thames. Dun, dun, dun. And, some debate rages on, et cetera, et cetera. Issues will continue. But this would basically be the last battle Harrison would be in charge of and lead, Because once this territory was won, issues, I guess you could say, began arising. And not just in the Northwest Territory, but the federal government as well. The Madison administration had a new Secretary of War, John Armstrong. And by all accounts, John Armstrong is an ineffective Secretary of War. He would actually be soon replaced by James Monroe. But effectively, this created differences, and Harrison and Armstrong disagreed on a lot of things on how to move forward with the war. Harrison's like, we should keep doing and going and going and going, we take some territory in Canada, and Armstrong's like, that's not, And it reached a point that it would effectively... Armstrong just got pissed, and he just effectively divided command of his army and giving command of the leading forces to a whole bunch of subordinates, and basically said, you know what, Harrison? Fuck you. You may have been this great leader, but you're going to be relegated to this fort. And Harrison is mad. He is livid. And it reaches the point where he just hates it. And ultimately he says, fuck it. If America falls, okay? And he retires and resigns in 1814. Understand when he retires and resigns in 1814, he's done. He's done with that military life. I think he's about 41. And, he just decides he's just going to retire, and it is what it is, and life is what it is like, unfortunately, for William Henry Harrison. But anyways, I think this is where the differences in personalities come in with different presidents and different individuals. Andrew Jackson, despite all the constant hurdles he would have to go through, would just keep on fighting. And then once Andrew Jackson was finished, he was just Andrew Jackson. William Henry Harrison, though, in contrast, was, he basically enjoyed himself. He felt himself. He was feeling himself, you know what I'm saying? He actually enjoyed his celebrity. He traveled all across the country, as a war hero figure, and, really enjoyed himself. He's just like, hey guys, you like me? Yeah, I know you guys like me, etc., etc. He retired and lived effectively in the North Bend area that is now considered Cincinnati, for a lot of reasons, because, Indiana was still didn't have a statehood. Ohio was a state at this particular point in time. So a lot of it actually was interesting, I guess you could say. I think a lot of it was both opportunity for land and some politics that would eventually happen. But initially, at the very least, he initially genuinely retired. biggest reason why I think he moved to Ohio was for money, and specifically future business ventures. He would try to diversify his properties in terms of crop yields, et cetera, speculation, and build his home in Ohio. And he also attempted to raise his kids, because he's not the most attentive father, unfortunately. Some problems, obviously, not to mention, too, a lot of them just kept dying, so he just wanted to be home and make sure his kids weren't going to die from anything that was going to happen. Anyways, he wanted more opportunity, though. I think he got bored at home, probably. A lot of the stuff happens, and he just wanted to do something because, again, he just kept failing at business ventures and, maybe get some more influence. He enjoyed his time as the governor of the territorial governor of Indiana. So once he was effectively stable, the house is built, everything's settled with his family and kids and all that. He decided he was going to run for office and run for the actual House of Representative seats for the state of Ohio in 1816. And it's fascinating once he's in, because it's an election year in 1816. So once he's in and he's about to do his House of Representative duties and whatnot, James Monroe, the president's like, "Hey fam, you want to be my Secretary of War?" And Harrison's like, "Oh, well, that's actually pretty legit. I could probably do some stuff, and too late. Just kidding. Harrison was asked to be Secretary of War, and he was just apprehensive because, it's a big duty. He wanted to just do some house stuff. And before he could even say yes, though, Monroe's like, dude, you gotta give me an answer now. And Monroe just didn't want to wait. So he ends up giving the Secretary of Warship to John C. Calhoun. Anyways, Harrison would spend his time in the House basically kind of failing. He lost a lot of opportunities and failed at many business ventures. It's around this particular point in time he would really go in debt, and it's unfortunate because, I think a lot of it emotionally was a bit troubling for William Henry Harrison. Probably really depressed, sad. He started losing, influence within his time as a House of Representatives member. Also, just with the reality that he was just an ineffectual politician didn't help. He's not a very politically savvy person. So it's just a compounding amount of issues, factors that really led William Henry Harrison into a bit of a downward spiral over this particular time. He was not a well-suited person for federal politics, let alone just politics in general. And unfortunately for him, he just says, I can't do this anymore, And his time in the House is really kind of pointless, especially around this particular point in time in the era of good feelings and, the one-party system. And, again, he's kind of apolitical. I don't know if he would be independent, but I think at this point he was kind of just Democratic, Republican just because, there's just one party. So, So 1820, he leaves the federal House of Representatives, or around that particular point in time. He comes home, runs for his state senate in 1820. Things were just tough, ever since he entered the federal government. I would probably say from 1816 to 1824. Just to sum it up succinctly, and what Harrison and his mindset ultimately is, it's just a downward spiral. Failures of businesses, failures of political savviness and influence. This was actually around the time too a lot of his kids started dying due to a lot of ill health, et cetera, and the debt for him just continues to rise with these poor business ventures and contentious issues with his family, his wife. Things are really just not looking good for him. Despite his popularity, it starts to wane a little bit. He actually attempts to run for governor in 1822 and loses it in a very, very, very close race, at least in terms of the timeline-wise, and he kind of just putters around at home when he's not really doing anything. That's probably really difficult, And, a lot of people would probably try to deal with it with alcohol, but he does not like to drink alcohol. And it's tough, and, he's trying to figure out how can I keep doing it, because despite the disastrous last 8 years of his life, because he's almost 50 around this point in time too, he's just trying to figure out, I need to persevere, and I need to overcome this, which is generally admirable for the most part. He persevered. around 1823-ish, 1824-ish. He actually becomes a presidential elector. I think that's really fascinating. And then eventually ends up pushing really hard and wins a seat back in the Senate, back into the actual federal Senate in 1824. And despite being roughly in his 50s, he was really vying for positions within the actual Adams administration. He was really close to Henry Clay at this particular point in time, who's going to be a very important person to his political and ideological future. And it's around this time, he's in his 50s. Henry Clay, who was the Secretary of State, ideologically speaking, I would probably say Henry Clay is pretty close to William Henry Harrison, despite the actual differences of because again, Harrison was apolitical, but they had a lot of similar ideas on how things were going to go for the most part in terms of infrastructure, federal government infrastructure, etc., etc. Both were slave owners, and they actually built a pretty strong bond during this particular point in time. And, obviously holding this lucrative office of the Senate really brought them much closer together, And I think Henry Clay in his mind was basically like, you're still a pretty popular person. You don't realize it, The Battle of Tippecanoe and the Thames, you're still very famous for. And anyways, like, during his time in the Senate, while vying for spots to be a part of the Adams administration, John Adams is kind of just like, well, okay, if you want to, we can send you to Columbia. And most people are probably like, wait, William Henry Harrison went to Columbia? Yeah, William Henry Harrison went to fucking Columbia, He went to Columbia to be the ambassador to, Columbia. And I'll just briefly kind of explain, at least, and again, I'm not a historian at all, and I'm especially not a historian of, Latin American history. But this was a very tumultuous time that William Henry Harrison was going to, because he would be the ambassador to Columbia in 1828. And it was around this time, it was very touch and go in Columbia. He arrived at a particular point of time when this man named Simon Bolivar started basically creating a military dictatorship. And it just so happens that Colombia and several other, Latin American nations are going to be under his control. Harrison, the entire time there, was miserable. I think he left his family there for the time being. I don't know if his wife came. I didn't really research because this was just a brief little thing I didn't even realize actually happened. And it was really brief, like I said, because he was miserable. And then early 1829, riots and all that stuff against Bolivar and little internal wars were actually happening during the actual contentious time that Simon Bolivar is trying to be this military dictator. And before anything bad happens, though, Andrew Jackson wins the presidency and tells Harrison, hey, come back home. I'm going to put in my own guy. And William Henry Harrison's like, oh, thank God. He's actually only there for really just a very, very brief time. So Harrison comes home. And again, for like what seems like the 50th time, retires in many ways, from basically his like late 20s to 60s. He's basically just been vying for political power and influence and really just trying to seek office in any way, shape, or form in the federal government and, just leadership roles in many ways, shape, and form. And he's still deeply in debt. He lived well beyond his means is probably the best way I could explain it. So once at this particular point in time, it's just like, I'm just going to stop. He just decides, like, he's at this point, he's in his late 50s, by the time he retires in like 1829, and just says, fuck it, all my many business ventures that I had hoped would lead me to wealth had failed, and all I really have is basically my military pension and my farm. And that's basically it. So he's just doing what he can, for the most part, just to produce what he can produce and try and get out of debt. And it was kind of embarrassing at points in time, because he would work at his his county's like courthouses and stuff and become a recorder to help pay off debts, But it's also around this particular time too. He would also begin the biography of the life of William Henry Harrison, So between his retirement and the election of 1836, William Henry Harrison is effectively just retired, attempting to live his life, attempting to figure out, how can I actually just, for the most part, make ends meet, and really just function and survive for the most part. Especially, he's still got a shit ton of kids that haven't died yet. His wife's not super happy with him, and he's just trying to survive. Which sounds kind of sad, but don't be sad for William Henry Harrison, because things are going to be really changing very soon, So moving very quickly, because for the most part, the time between his retirement and the election of 1836, Harrison's really just out of the spotlight, I guess you could say, for the most part. But the election of 1836, Harrison kind of comes back, and I don't know if it's specifically planned or purposeful, but William Henry Harrison, by around that particular point in time, finishes that said biography that he, or the people basically, it's going to be released, I guess you could say, and created at this particular point in time, and, the Whig Party is being formed and created, and knock on the door, Henry Clay and other Whigs are like, hey, so, you're still relatively popular, and this book, the biography of your life it's coming out, and we think you might actually be able to become president, Harrison's like, what? Me? Little old me? Become president? I would probably say early 60s, around this particular point in time. And, I'm talking about, he's still relatively popular, and the biography proves to be very, very popular for the Whigs and William Henry Harrison himself. And he speculates, and his wife is like, look, if you're gonna do this, fine, I'm not gonna stop you. And he still wants to, I guess you could say, have power. He wants to feel purposeful again, because the last couple of years have been really meaningless for him in a lot of ways. And Henry Clay basically saw him as the key piece, specifically to split the votes that would effectively give William Henry Harrison the presidency. So he thinks about this. He's like, okay, so I would be the candidate for, the all non-slave states, as the other members would be, non-slave states, like at least in the Ohio Territory, northern, like all those states for the most part. And it's complicated, I guess you could say, because obviously they had their own specific candidate, but they felt that William Henry Harrison had the best opportunity to win the North, surprisingly, even though he was a slave owner himself, and, not the greatest slave owner, if I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I don't even want to go deep into that, because a lot of presidents had owned slaves at some point, and he's just like your typical slave owner. Let's just be honest with you with that. Anyways, as the other members of the candidates would be the guys that would win in their respective states. And again, this election is fascinating because they almost won this election of 1836. They actually almost won this election. And the only states, unfortunately, that they would lose in would be Pennsylvania and New York, which I kind of briefly explained with Van Buren. Yeah, that's about it for the most part. And he doesn't really do anything during this particular election. He's just vibing. He's feeling himself. He's chilling. He's doing his thing. And he's like, oh, okay, well, I guess I lost. But this kind of gets into his mind a little bit. He's like, I almost won, though. I was second. Martin Van Buren, if he got like 700,000 votes, William Henry Harrison, got like 550. I'm not saying that they had just combined their forces and their votes into William Henry Harrison, but there's a genuine reality where William Henry Harrison probably could have just won had they not done this whole trying to split the vote thing. But it's understandable, because I don't even think they understood that they were capable of being able to do that. Anyways, the time between the election of 1836 to 1840 is very, very fascinating. He was very keen on running again. He wanted real opportunity. And I think Henry Clay was a little bit apprehensive because he wanted to run himself, because he himself was getting old. But the truth is that it wasn't probably going to happen. So he's like, all right, fine, we'll just go behind you. There's a lot of support he was receiving. And it was very clear from the get-go that he had the best chances of winning, because Clay wanted to, and Daniel Webster wanted to, but they were not very popular in comparative reality. So the Whigs held a convention for the main frontrunners for the eventual 1840 election. They were William Henry Harrison, Henry Clay, Winfield Scott, I'm going to add to. And after several ballots, they were basically just like, well, fuck, we might as well have to go with William Harrison for the most part in 1839. And they were very, very, very apprehensive for numerous reasons. One, William Henry Harrison was 67 years old. And number two, I don't think anyone, like, William Henry Harrison, despite being this great war hero, etc., it was very clear that if he becomes president, then, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were going to be the guys to really kind of influence and lead the country, I guess you could say, because he's a very apolitical person, doesn't really know a whole bunch of, not a very politically savvy person. He was probably just going to do what the Whigs wanted him to do. And I guess you could say a lot of people had apprehensions within the actual party itself, because it's like, well, a lot of us aren't, these Whig type people, because there's slave owners within the actual Whig, party, and a lot of people, because remember, the Whigs are just the anti-Jackson party, so they were potentially ripe for potential corruption, and a lot of people were apprehensive to that idea that William Henry Harrison could actually be president. But that being said, 67 years old, that was really big. And I actually think it's really fascinating, too, that fate works in very mysterious ways, because John Tyler would be his vice presidential running mate, and he was pegged for the main reason for being the specific Southern candidate that was going to get the South to join, because he was basically a lifelong Democrat, and he just yeeted away from the party because of Andrew Jackson, and he basically became a Whig just by virtue of being anti-Jackson, because John Tyler's so aggressively, strictly states' rights, and a very fascinating character. But fate works in mysterious ways, because while Tyler and Harrison in particular aren't personally very close, I would say, their lives are going to be intertwined in various different ways. Their lives have always kind of been intertwined throughout their entire lives. Both their fathers are very, very, very important individuals in the actual founding of the revolution in this country, etc., etc. They're very prominent individuals. Both parents for both these men would be governors of Virginia, I believe, at one point. A little tidbit too. Again, I can't confirm this, but I'm pretty sure they were actually next door neighbors at one point within their actual lives, which is deeply interesting. But hey, you want to run for president with me? He's like, fuck it, I might as well join you. Anyways, life works in very fucking mysterious ways. Anywho, the election of 1840. I don't even know how to really explain it. It's one of the most fascinating elections, and it's probably going to be one of the elections that I do just a full-blown episode on, because it's just fascinating. It deserves its own just hour and a half long explanation. For those of you who don't know, this election would be considered, I would say, one of the first modern campaigns, one of the first actual campaigns on a campaign trail, okay? Because you have to understand, the times of Jefferson, Adams, etc., and really up until this election, presidents and presidential hopefuls never campaigned. They never went from place to place. They basically just stayed at home, vibed out, smoked a doobie, and really relaxed. And no one really did anything. Most of the actual influence of, hey, vote for this person was going to be through newspapers, through word of mouth. Even some people just being like, hope you guys vote for, Andrew Jackson, yada, 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 and a lot of support was really built up in that way. But the actual presidential hopefuls never campaigned themselves. There was a lot of things that really led to this in a lot of reasons, in a lot of ways. First and foremost, the Democratic Party, despite the tumultuous relationship and presidency, I guess you could say, of Martin Van Buren, it was very clear that they were still very strong. I'm not saying they would have won this election, but you have the strength of the Democratic Party coinciding with this weird upstart Whig party that is clearly kind of conniving. I don't want to say conniving, that sounds bad, but it's like the previous election, they try to split the vote between 4 different candidates to like try and win an election instead of just winning it with this person's the best, and if you don't like our platform, then because that did turn off a lot of people, and a lot of people didn't know what the Whigs were. In fact, the platform that Harrison and Tyler effectively really played on was really vague, to be honest with you, because they didn't really have any. They weren't stir fire on any particular issue, which was a bit of a downfall for Martin Van Buren, because he's like steadfast, no Texas, I don't want to expand slavery, the economy is what it is. I'm gonna try and do my independent treasury thing, but this, like, he was steadfast. And if you don't like that platform, then so be it. So, I guess you could say started the actual tradition of vague platforms. And they effectively just ran what can be considered the first modern campaign. Presidential hopefuls going on the campaign trail, going from place to place. John Tyler did most of it because Harrison was really old, and John Tyler's like, well, let's go and campaign, giving speeches and whatnot, and other people were really doing it for them, I guess you could say. But, this is also where some speeches are made, people petitioning for the support of the actual people itself, like William Henry Harrison, like in newspapers being like, I vote for me, is a vote for, all this, etc., etc. Campaign slogans, campaign songs, Tippecanoe and Tyler too is one of the most prominent and first well-known campaign slogans of all time. And the platform itself was basically simple. We're going to play into my military record and the failures of the Democrats with probably at this particular point in time one of the worst financial crises in this country's history. It was known as the Log Cabin Campaign. They wanted to show William Henry Harrison as the grandpa of the country, the man of the common people, even though truth is that William Henry Harrison is probably the farthest thing from that in his entire life. I just want to point out, too, that this is probably the first election in this country's history where I would say, because I think most elections, honestly, are tied to economics, and most people really want money and to financially support their family. So if you have a bit of an economic downfall, your party is probably not going to be winning. And this is the first election that absolutely proves it. The election comes close, and despite of actually a close popular vote, the campaigning and the strategy would work. William Henry Harrison would win the presidency with an electoral college victory of 234-60 against the incumbent Martin Van Buren, winning 52% of the popular vote and becoming the 9th president of the United States of America. Let's just get down to it. William Henry Harrison would have the shortest presidency in this country's history, and I just want to explain the events that would lead to that. So, William Henry Harrison, let's just be honest, he's someone that's just vibing himself. He's a bit of in some ways, narcissistic when it comes to, let's be honest, if you win the presidency, I'm going to be a little bit narcissistic too, okay? And it's just fascinating. As soon as he is inaugurated, he's supposed to go to Washington. His wife is ill, and she is, again, like I said, the only first lady never to be in the White House, I believe. She's too ill to travel, so she ends up staying behind. And William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, they go to Washington. And actually, I don't even know if Tyler might have been there, and actually, that might have been actually the first time they met, I believe. I'm not sure. Anyways, Harrison's there, and he takes the actual oath of office, which people, I note 2 things. It was cold and wet, and William Henry Harrison did not wear clothing that would otherwise, I guess you could say, protect him from the weathered environments. And I'll go into how he dies in a second, and some debate whether this actually was the reason why he died. He could have had other ailments before that too. He's 68 years old. Probably could have had cancer. We just didn't even know about it. But things work in very fascinating ways. Anyways, he had the single longest inaugural address in this country's history. 8,500 words that took him 2 hours to read. And you have to understand, this wasn't the edited speech, by the way. It was much, much longer. And he was also, notably, the first president to have his photograph taken. So the photograph you see, like if you go to like just his Wikipedia page, that's the very first photograph of the actual president in 1840 with the whole daguerreotype type photographs and pictures and whatnot. And then afterwards, he would ride in a carriage and attend the inaugural balls that are customary. And, life is seemingly pretty good, And things are very fascinating for old William Henry Harrison. Despite being the shortest-lived president, he would actually have some interesting issues he would have to deal with, per se. The party leader, Clay, was a very determined and driven man and wanted to use his influence to basically put his people in the cabinet. And because you have to understand this, at this particular point in time, the party for the Whigs was basically Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, who would be the two most important figures within the Whigs themselves, and they're both so ideologically opposed that they're kind of fighting each other for the actual party lead. And Henry Clay tried to stuff his people within Harrison's cabinet, and Harrison rebuffed him and said, well, I'm going to make Daniel Webster my Secretary of State and give Webster's people a chance, which really pissed off Henry Clay, which for Henry Clay thought it was kind of a lost opportunity for him. Let's just talk about some stuff before we actually go into his death. His cabinet includes Daniel Webster, like I said, as the Secretary of State, John Tyler, his successor, as Vice President, and notably the first successor, and notably John Bell and John Crittenden as the Secretary of War and Attorney General. And I only point them out because they are very interesting and fascinating individuals in terms of politics, and they would both play large roles in politics for the next 30 years. John Bell being one of the nominees for president in the election of 1860. Immediately, Harrison, and at the start of his presidency, gets sick immediately. While attending to business and meeting with a whole bunch of different people, constituents, attempting to appoint people, some judges and all that stuff, he starts coughing. He gets ill. Some people argue how he died and some of the illnesses and stuff, and a little bit like Washington, some people say the doctors actually made things worse because he had some bloodletting and stuff, and it depends on how you perceive it. So a lot of people say tuberculosis, influenza, and pneumonia. Some people say like a bacterial infection, something close like typhoid fever, that actually forced him to go into septic shock, effectively. A lot of people say the water supply, along with the sewage, because there's no water standards in that particular era, probably didn't help. And, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I tend to believe much more of the actual bacterial infection at that particular time, crossing with his age in particular. If you hear dogs, I apologize. Crossing with his age, it's really not to be messed with, okay? And initially from the get-go, media didn't announce it, that he was sick, and they didn't want to shock people initially, but there was rumblings that people were kind of like in the know-how. And John Tyler, he kind of understood this. He knew this was happening too around this particular point in time. So when he got the news of the sickness, he's not shocked, or when Harrison dies, he's not shocked. Exactly 1 month after taking office, William Henry Harrison dies, and John Tyler will become the first vice president to take over the presidency. So for this ending, this is actually probably going to be one of the quicker ones I tend to do too. This episode will probably generally be pretty short in comparison to some of the other episodes. William Henry Harrison is the opposite of what I tend to find when I do deep dives on people. When I do deep dives on people and presidents, I tend to find a lot more things in which I understand about them, and I find some level of admiration about them, even if I don't like them. Some people, especially probably more on the conservative side, tend to not like FDR, and I don't like FDR at all. But the more research I've done into him, the more I'm kind of just like, okay, I understand, And don't get me wrong, the more I understand about FDR too, the more I actually generally don't like him either. But William Henry Harrison, the more I look into, the more I really try and see all the research that I can do, reading all the biographies. That biography that was about Henry Harrison during the Whig election, and then just some research papers and trying to understand. Then when you go into like the deep dives of like the Battle of Tippecanoe, the Battle of the Thames, etc., etc., I lose admiration for William Henry Harrison, and I lose more credibility for William Henry Harrison, because the more you look into him, the more I just don't like him, you know. And he's someone that, like, I probably should try and like, but, you know, I just think he's just someone that was a failure, an opportunistic individual who, despite doing some good things, ultimately really didn't accomplish anything fundamentally meaningful that wasn't military based, you know. And he was, and unlike Washington, he was someone that always vied for power, you know, and really just wanted excessive influence in things that he was ill prepared to grossly influence, you know. And don't get me wrong, it's probably just, I'm biased, you know, but I do this research and I'm just like, you know, he's just failed. You know, he was an ill-prepared person. He's just not someone that should have held political office, or someone that was capable of holding political office, you know. And it's not that he wasn't capable. He just chose not to do it, or effectively be as effective as he probably and possibly could be, you know. Like, say what you will about Martin Van Buren, but he was always someone that I think would always try and rise above the challenge and always try to persevere despite, you know, an immaculable amount of insecurities that would stem from his life. William Henry Harrison's a little bit different. You know, he's just an opportunistic individual and kind of petty in a lot of ways, you know. I just don't like people that tend to put themselves a lot of the times over their own country, or, you know what I mean, like someone that he would kind of be seen today as a bit of a sneaky kind of person, someone who really should not be holding political office. Is he a good person? I think he could be a good person. I think he at times really did do things that were really good and really beneficial for a lot of people. But, you know, the more you look into it, the more I can't say that he's this, you know, great person or this great president or this great individual, you know. And, you know, the more I look into what he would have potentially become as a president, I think is even more fascinating, because the more I look into it, you know, a lot of people will try and say, you know, one way or another, but he's probably going to be Daniel Webster's puppets, you know, or even eventually Henry Clay's puppet, because, you know, he's a political opportunist, you know, not the greatest politically savvy person, but if Henry Clay was going to basically say, hey, we'll give you this for that, you know, he's probably going to say yes. And, you know, it's a bit of a what if and a watershed moment within this country's history about the legacy of William Henry Harrison. And, you know, I guess if I could just leave you on this one particular note, how should we remember William Henry Harrison? I think that's up to you. And I think that's up to the actual person himself. But, you know, I think this is an opportunity for people to do their own research. Look into William Henry Harrison, you know. Because there are things that he does that are good. But when you take it all in, the amalgamation of who he is, his character, just his life, you know, I don't have strong positive feelings about William Henry Harrison. And I think things happen for a reason, you know. And I think history works in a very funny way. So if I could just say this about William Henry Harrison, if you want to remember him, just remember he was a president, even if it was only for a month. William Henry Harrison was our 9th president, and showed that, you know what, you may be an old man, you may be grampy, but hey, you know what, things can happen. You could become president, and the world works in mysterious ways is probably what I would say for William Henry Harrison's presidency and just his life and his legacy. How you choose to see him and view him, that's up to you guys. Anyways, thanks for listening. Hope you guys listen to the next episode.